program for today. We have a whodunit. It's going to be a big question mark the whole time. And fortunately, we have a scholar here that can solve that problem for us. Yes. Dr. Felicia Londré, Curator's Professor, Emerita Professor from UMKC, Department of Theatre, and resident theater historian for the city is probably the best way I can describe her. And she is also the president of Moliere 400 in 2022. And if you don't know what that is, find out, because it's a really exciting program. And Felicia is leading the charge. And so with that, I'm going to turn us, however, from Moliere back to Shakespeare and Dr. Felicia Londré.
Thank you, Dr. Jennifer Martin, and she's played a big part in preparing for the 400th birthday of Moliere. I have handouts, but you won't want to look at them till afterwards if you want to check some facts, and also some little handouts on the Moliere events. Thank you all for coming today. Yes?
Slides up now.
Okay, thank you. If there's one literary figure in the entire history of civilization whose name is known and respected among peoples of all nations, languages, religions, and ethnic backgrounds, that one is Shakespeare. That name is often associated in the public mind with a fairly familiar image, a face based upon the portrait in the folio edition of the works of William Shakespeare. That face was familiar to 19th century French. Oh, it's not moving forward. 19th century French readers. Okay, it worked a little while ago. Nope, back. Oh, there we go. 19th century French readers, as it is to contemporary American theater goers. The face is known to people as far apart as Spain and Russia and China. When an image is as recognizable as Shakespeare's 400-year-old face, you can make jokes using the face or the name, and people will get it. Can I quote you? Not the William Shakespeare. Oh, wow, another sonnet? Sorry, I haven't written much lately, neither has Shakespeare. This one is British humor. Ado and much ado. Shakespeare with holes and no holes barred. And finally, Big Bard and Sesame Street. When a face is as well known and trusted as Shakespeare's, you can use it to endorse products. Here's an 1864 advertisement for Bard of Avon perfume and Shakespeare sachet. 1899, Shakespeare Boiled Down was a little freebie booklet you could get if you bought a new home sewing machine. 1990, a magazine ad using Shakespeare as an apartment salesman. Also in 1990, right here in Kansas City, American Heartland used the familiar Shakespeare face, although they never in their history produced a Shakespeare play. The face is often used to advertise its own product. And here we have a 1989 program cover for Shakespeare. The face can be given a contemporary look and can be adapted to other historical periods. And it can be popularized. 1989, Three Rivers Shakespeare Festival in Pittsburgh had a 4-page comic book featuring Super Bard saving Pittsburgh from a summer of malaise. But as well as we know that face, what do we really know about the man behind the face? Do we really know who Shakespeare was? Houston, that's a Houston festival, and one American theater festival, Carmel Shakespeare Company, gave you a choice. This incorporates 2 of the faces into their logo, the faces of both the leading candidate for the authorship of the plays and sonnets, and William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon, and Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. In October 1991, Atlantic Monthly focused national attention on the subject of the Shakespeare authorship question with a cover story that included both the so-called Stratfordian and Oxfordian points of view. I hit the wrong button. In April 1999, Harper's Magazine took a similarly even-handed stance. With these articles and many others in the popular press, the big question, who really wrote the plays and sonnets under the name Shakespeare, is out in the open. It's not limited to scholarly debate, as you can tell when people are joking about it. I'm confused. Was Shakespeare somebody else, or was somebody else Shakespeare? This is an old one, Shakespeare X'd out and Francis Bacon written in. This is newer. In fact, the work's been so good that we question whether it's Will's own. I asked Will if he wrote it. He said he didn't know. Why on earth should we question the very identity of the all-time greatest writer of the English language? Actually, there has been a steady stream of doubts about the identity of Shakespeare over the centuries, but not until 1929, with the publication of the original edition of this book, was a truly viable candidate identified as the man behind the Shakespeare name. On the cover of this later edition, you see the familiar folio face known as the Droeshout engraving, which has been accepted as the only portrait of Shakespeare approved by those who knew him in life. Below are two portraits of Edward de Vere, one painted in his youth and the other in his maturity. J. Thomas Loney, the author of this book, was an English schoolmaster who taught and studied the plays for years. It bothered him that the material of the plays did not match up with anything that was known about William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon. And Loney became convinced that the Stratford man could not have been the author. Loney began by making a list of characteristics of the author that were manifest in the writings. He listed 18 characteristics, such as superior education with emphasis on the classics, membership in the higher aristocracy, enthusiasm for Italy, interest in sports, including falconry, Lancastrian, that is Red Rose, sympathies in the Wars of the Roses, poor financial management, a conflicted attitude toward women, probably Catholic leanings, and so on. This is a simplified version of Loney's list. And when you get your handout later, you can review the list. Then Loney undertook a systematic search of Elizabethan lives, hoping to find someone who would fit most of the characteristics he had listed. Imagine his excitement when he found someone whose documented life and personality fit all 18 points. Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. Now, my first impulse when I heard about the Shakespeare authorship question was to scoff at all those crackpot claims that Shakespeare was somebody else. Over the years, we heard a lot of crazy ideas that Shakespeare's plays were written by names you see here, Christopher Marlowe, Francis Bacon, Earl of Derby, or even Queen Elizabeth herself. When I first heard the claim that Edward de Vere, as author in 1985, I was not interested. I loved the idea of a disadvantaged country boy who pulled himself up by his genius to become the greatest writer in the English language. And I still do believe that the spark of genius can exist in any person, no matter what his or her background. But eventually, as a responsible scholar, I had to admit, first, there is reason enough to at least doubt the received wisdom that we've always taken on faith. And second, that the available evidence, when examined dispassionately, has mounted up more convincingly in favor of Edward de Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford, than that which supports the traditional or orthodox view. Well, yes, there are still unanswered questions. All we can do is examine the evidence as honestly and objectively as possible and make a reasoned judgment. The book that stimulated my search for the truth was Charlton Ogburn's The Mysterious William Shakespeare, The Myth and the Reality. This copiously documented 890-page book surveys the evidence for Edward Devere, 17th Earl of Oxford, and the evidence against the man from Stratford upon Avon. There are various kinds of evidence available: intertextual, chronological, topical, stylistic, biographical, and even cryptographic. In our limited time, I'm going to draw most heavily upon the biographical evidence. There is an extraordinary correlation between the material of the plays and the events of Oxford's life. Why does it matter who wrote the plays? The pursuit of truth is one of humankind's noblest endeavors. If the historical truth of the Shakespeare authorship question doesn't matter, then what history does matter? Furthermore, all creative endeavor arises from individual experience and bears a personal stamp. With Devere's full and fascinating biography behind them, the plays come to life as never before. They click neatly into the Elizabethan social context instead of having to be uncomfortably forced. And then too, well, if you have ever written a poem or painted a picture or acted a role on stage, you know the torment and joy and ultimately the pride that comes with creating a work of art. Any artist wants recognition for his or her work, and the Shakespeare plays and sonnets abound with artfully placed clues that lead us to Devere. For example, Shakespeare is full of notable quotes about truth. Devere's family name, Vere, means truth. Indeed, the Oxford family motto is Vero nihil verius, nothing truer than truth. Indeed, the Oxford family, and it's uncanny how often in Shakespeare the word truth crops up in conjunction with the word ever, a pun on E for Edward and ver, an alternate spelling of Vere. Since ever is a fairly common word, it might seem extravagant or silly of me to suggest that whenever you hear ever in Shakespeare, you should consider whether it could be read as E Vere. But the author himself tells us that he consciously indulged in this usage. Look at Sonnet 76. In the first 5 lines, you get verse, variation, ever, and then comes the zinger. That every word doth almost tell my name. Every is Evere, every word is like Edward. Well, now you can see what's going on in an otherwise cryptic bit of dialogue from Hamlet. Act 1, Scene 2. Horatio says, "The same, my lord, and your poor servant ever." And Hamlet replies, "Sir, my good friend, I'll change that name with you." There will be other examples of this kind of thing later on. As I present my brief overview of the Oxfordian case, I don't ask that you convert on the spot to the Oxfordian point of view. It's very difficult to reject the orthodox position that most of us grew up with. All I'm asking is that you bring to the subject an open mind. I'm calling for intellectual honesty. And the best example I know of intellectual honesty is the Missouri author, Mark Twain. In 1909, well before Loney tracked down and put forward Oxford's candidacy, Mark Twain published a short work titled, "Is Shakespeare Dead?" From My Autobiography, in which he humorously points out how many conjectures, suppositions, maybes, perhapses, rumors, guesses, probabilities, likelihoods, might have beens, could have beens, should have beens, must have beens are necessary to construct the biography of the Stratford man. And then Twain added, "In the assuming trade, 3 separate and independent cults are transacting business. 2 of the cults are known as the Shakespeareites and the Baconians, and I am the other one, the Brontosaurian." The Shakespearite knows that Shakespeare of Stratford wrote Shakespeare's works. The Baconian knows that Francis Bacon wrote them. The Brontosaurian doesn't really know which of them did it, but is quite composedly and contentedly sure that Shakespeare didn't. Well, that's what I call intellectual honesty, to look at the evidence and while admitting that you don't have the ultimate answer, to take a lonely stand against the experts and their 350-year-old tradition. I'm going to be referring to three distinct identities. One is Will Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon, who lived from 1564 to 1616. During his lifetime, his name was spelled in various ways, as you see here, but always with the short A, Shack. Numerous local documents have survived to show that his principal known occupation was dealing in malts and grains, to the extent that he must have spent much of his time in Stratford upon Avon. We cannot even prove that he knew how to write. His 6 surviving signatures, as impartial handwriting experts will attest, are those of an illiterate. Those who believe that Shakespeare of Stratford wrote the plays are called Stratfordians. The second identity is that of Edward Devere, 17th Earl of Oxford, Lord Great Chamberlain of England, Viscount Bolbec, and holder of various other titles. He lived from 1550 to 1604, and his principal activities were theater related. He is known to have acted in plays at court. He was a patron of a theater company by 1580 and soon took over the management of the Earl of Worcester's company. Later, as Lord Great Chamberlain of England, he might have had some involvement with the Lord Chamberlain's Men, the company that produced the Shakespeare plays. This sample of his penmanship is a letter Edward Devere wrote when he was 13. He was fluent in French, as you see here, and in Latin. Many of his contemporaries wrote their praise of him and his writing. For example, Gabriel Harvey wrote in 1578, "Thy merit is a wonder which reaches as far as the heavenly orbs. Witness how greatly thou dost excel in letters. Thine eyes flash fire, thy countenance shakes a spear." Those who believe that Edward Devere, 17th Earl of Oxford, wrote the plays and sonnets are called Oxfordians. Will Shakespeare of Stratford and Edward Devere, 17th Earl of Oxford, were real people. Both men really lived during the Elizabethan period. The third identity to which I will refer is an author known as William Shakespeare. The fact that this name often appeared with a hyphen between Shake and Spear on all the published works and in dedications by other writers indicates that Shakespeare was recognizably a pseudonym. This is the name, as you see here, you see the hyphenated name on both of those, the name by which the author of the plays and sonnets chose to be known to the public. The question is, which man, Shakespeare of Stratford or Edward Devere, 17th Earl of Oxford, was the real person behind the fictitious name? If it was Devere, the pen name was a necessity. Oxford would have had to conceal his authorship from the general public because in those days, members of the aristocracy were careful not to let their great family names be exploited for mass consumption, whether it be a printed quarto edition of a narrative poem or a play performed in the public playhouse. In Devere's case, the need to conceal his authorship was doubly important because the plays incorporate some skeletons from the closet of a family that was very close to the throne. And because the plays are full of sensitive political references and sly digs at prominent members of society by someone who could only have been an intimate of the court. So if Devere wrote them, it's not surprising that his authorship was doubly important, that to conceal his authorship was doubly important, because the plays incorporate some skeletons from the closet of a family that was very close to the throne. Oh, I just said that, okay. So if Devere wrote them, it's not surprising, sorry, that the first 6 Shakespeare plays to be published bore no author's name at all. And yet, as I said, he left clues for us. Let's look more closely at the printer's emblem on both of these quarto title pages. Jurescit vulneri veritas is Latin for truth springs forth from a wound. In virescit, we have another pun on Vere's name. If you pronounce it, Vere is it. Veritas, of course, is truth, and it's from the Devere family motto. Robert Sean Brazel has shown the connection between Edward de Vere and this printer, Thomas Creed. Eventually, it would be necessary to settle on a pseudonym if you wanted to continue seeing his plays performed, whether published or not. I don't want to spend much time on the first identity, Will Shakesper of Stratford-on-Avon. That's why, well, you all know, and you have the handout that lists virtually every fact that can be documented about him. But later, when you look over the handouts, you'll note that he was accused of hoarding grain. He was a tax delinquent. He failed to pay off his wife's 40-shilling debt. He tried to enclose public lands, and he was constantly bringing suits against his fellow townsmen. None of that, of course, precludes his having been the author. It's just what we know about him, what we can prove. However, I would like to mention briefly a couple of arguments against Shakespeare's having been a man of letters, besides the illiterate signatures. The truth is, there is not one single surviving reference to him as a poet or writer during his lifetime. Neither Shakespeare, nor any member of his family, nor any acquaintance of his in Stratford or in London ever claimed he was a writer. Shakespeare's will provides another argument against identifying him with Shakespeare. According to Mark Twain, it was eminently and conspicuously a businessman's will, not a poet's. It mentioned not a single book. Books were much more precious than swords and silver gilt bowls and second-best beds in those days. And when a departing person owned one, he gave it a high place in his will. This will mentioned not a play, not a poem, not an unfinished literary work, not a scrap of manuscript of any kind. The second page of the will is quite interesting, for it's here that we see the famous bequest to his fellows, John Hemminges, Richard Burbage, and Henry Condell, 26 shillings, 8 pence apiece to buy them rings. This mention of players from the Lord Chamberlain's company provides our only concrete link between the Stratford man named Shakespeare and the London theatre. However, you will note that this bequest is written in between the lines of the will, perhaps as an afterthought from Shakespeare, or perhaps added later as a false clue in what might be a different handwriting. Shakespeare's will makes no mention of shares in the Globe or Blackfriars theaters, nor do shares owned by Shakespeare ever show up in the records of Shakespeare's heirs. In contrast, such playhouse shares, as well as books, are specified in the wills of Hemminges and Condell. When you visit Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon, you see Shakespeare's final resting place beneath an engraved slab in the floor. But set in the side wall of the church is this rather odd monument. Beneath the effigy is a cryptic inscription beginning with 2 lines in Latin that bear no relationship to anything in Shakespeare. The poem is also an elaborate riddle. Read, if thou canst, whom envious death hath placed. If Stratford villagers knew Shakespeare only as a grain merchant, there's nothing in this inscription that would raise questions. The riddle is compounded by the fact that the monument we see today is not the original one. We know from Sir William Dugdale's Antiquities of Warwickshire, published in 1656, that the sculpture in the original monument depicted Shakespeare not with quill pen in hand, but clutching a grain sack. On top is a skull that's missing its jaw. Another eyewitness depiction of the original is in Nicholas Rowe's 1799 edition of the works of Mr. William Shakespeare. And again, he was shown, as Ogberg puts it, not as a literary figure, but as a dealer in bagged commodities. It's fair to assume that the effigy was given the quill pen and parchment that we see today only after everyone who could have known Shakespeare personally was dead. Well, now let's zero in on the fascinating life of Edward de Vere. He was born at Castle Hedingham in Essex on April 12th or April 22nd, if you adjust for the Gregorian calendar, in 1550. The Earls of Oxford descended from Aubrey Vere, who came from Normandy with William the Conqueror, and were granted the hereditary title Lord Great Chamberlain of England. The five-pointed star and the blue boar are the main distinguishing features of the Vere arms. So it's interesting that Shakespeare named Falstaff's favorite tavern the Blue Boar, or the Boar's Head, sorry, the Boar's Head, and included Earls of Oxford as characters in several of the history plays. The Bulbeck crest was a lion rampant, and this is the device that our man, Edward de Vere, carried on his shield in tournament. It was only after 1572, when he had won renown for breaking spears at jousting, that the Bulbeck lion was shown brandishing, maybe you might even say shaking, a broken spear. Edward de Vere was the son of John de Vere, 16th Earl of Oxford, and his second wife, Margaret Golding. Edward received an excellent education at home, so that at the age of 9, he was able to matriculate at St. John's College in Cambridge. He must have enjoyed riding with his father in the hunt, for he became an expert horseman and falconer. Falconry was a sport available only to the wealthy aristocracy, and Shakespeare's plays abound with the technical vocabulary of falconry and with the imagery based on it. In 1561, when Edward de Vere was 11 years old, the 28-year-old Queen Elizabeth came with her retinue for a 4-day stage at Castle Hedingham. And this was the occasion for much festivity, including theatrical presentations. Such visits by the Queen were to be welcomed as a signal honor, but they also meant considerable expense for the host. Having to offer hospitality to the Queen's numerous retainers meant that there were a lot of strangers in the house, perhaps taking note of the wealth on display, or maybe like the 100 retainers visiting King Lear. When a prominent family had a son who was not yet of legal age, it sometimes happened that the head of the family died unexpectedly and prematurely, as did the 16th Earl of Oxford. This would bring a coveted opportunity for self-enrichment to the son's legal guardian. At the time of the Queen's royal progress to Castle Hedingham, Sir William Cecil had just been appointed Master of the Wards. Thus, when the father of the 12-year-old Edward de Vere died a year later, the boy was sent to live at Cecil House in the Strand in London, and at Theobald's, which was Cecil's country house and boasted the finest garden in England. Sir William Cecil's legal guardianship and tight control of Edward de Vere lasted until the young Earl turned 21. Not long after the 16th Earl's death, his widow remarried. As Hamlet observes, the funeral baked meats did coldly furnish forth the marriage tables. An obsession with fickleness in women is apparent, not only in the Shakespeare plays and sonnets, but also in the early poems circulated at court that are known to have been written by Edward de Vere. That obsession applies to the most important woman in his life, Queen Elizabeth. Margaret Golding de Vere Tyrrell had a brother, Arthur Golding, who became Edward de Vere's scholarly mentor. Golding is remembered for one literary achievement, the first English translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, published by installments in the 1560s, when the process of translation could well have served as the basis for young Devere's Latin studies. As any Shakespeare lover knows, the single most frequent source of classical allusions in the Shakespeare plays and sonnets is Ovid's Metamorphoses. And most scholars believe that Shakespeare must have known the original Latin as well as Golding's English version. It's even possible that the translation was the collaborative product of their lessons, for which the boy allowed his uncle to claim pride of authorship. At 14, Edward de Vere was awarded his degree from St. John's College, and Queen Elizabeth attended the graduation ceremonies, as she did when he received his Master of Arts degree at Oxford 2 years later. Unfortunately for young Edward de Vere, his guardian, William Cecil, the future Lord Burleigh, exercised complete financial control over Oxford's estate until he was 21. During this time, Cecil made astonishing progress to great wealth as his ward's estate dwindled. Thus, Oxford grew up in the household of the man who is generally acknowledged to have been the real-life model for Polonius in Hamlet. In fact, the first quarto version of Hamlet gives that character the name Corambus, which clearly mocks Cecil's motto, coram una, cor unum via una. Furthermore, Cecil presided over the law court that had jurisdiction over the writ of coram nobis, pertaining to those who lost their rights during a period of insanity or minority. Sir William Cecil also exercised far-reaching control over family records, including correspondence as well as public documents. He was in a position to suppress any writing that might discredit the family name. Given the mockery inherent in the character name Corambus, it's not surprising that only 2 copies of the 1603 quarto edition of Hamlet are extant, and that the character's name was subsequently changed. Most of the links between William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, and Polonius, however, were private jokes that would have been caught only by intimates of the court. One amusing example mocks the frequent boast of Cecil as a good Protestant that he had been born during the Diet of Worms in 1521, when Martin Luther had stood firm against the Holy Roman Emperor. After Hamlet has killed the old man and Claudius asks, "Where's Polonius?" Hamlet replies, "A certain convocation of politic worms are even at him. Your worm is your only emperor for diet." The author of Hamlet knew things about William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, and the family that could only have been known to a member of the household. Corambus's, and in later editions, Polonius's, advice to Laertes, neither a borrower nor a lender be, unmistakably echoes the maxims that William Cecil wrote out for his son Robert Cecil when the latter set off to study in Paris, as Laertes did. "Beware, thou spendest not more than 3 or 4 parts thy revenue. Trust not any man with thy life credit or estate," and so on and so on. Those handwritten precepts were not published until 1618, 2 years after the death of Will Shakespeare of Stratford. It's not possible that a commoner from Warwickshire should have seen a private manuscript at Cecil House. And even if a commoner had somehow heard about it from a network of servants, as some Stratfordians propose, he would certainly not have dared to make it an object of satire. Edward de Vere, on the other hand, had the motive and the courage to mock the powerful Sir William Cecil. The overbearing Cecil had enriched himself at his ward's expense, regularly employed spies to report on Oxford's activities, the way Polonius employs Reynaldo, and exercised tyrannical control over Oxford's reputation as well as his private papers. In 1567, Oxford was admitted to Gray's Inn to study law. it is significant that Mark Twain, a decade before anyone ever heard of Edward de Vere as a candidate for the authorship, wrote that he would narrow his search for the real Shakespeare down to a single question. Was the candidate for authorship a lawyer? According to Mark Twain, the plays and poems of Shakespeare supply ample evidence that their author not only had a very extensive and accurate knowledge of the law, but that he was well acquainted with the manners of the Inns of Court and with legal life generally. At the same time, the adolescent De Vere's behavior was full of wild oats. He gained a reputation for being impulsive, spendthrift, and undisciplined. He enjoyed carousing in taverns in the manner of Prince Hal. Although De Vere's drinking companions were mostly writers like John Lilly, Anthony Mundy, and Robert Greene, his guardian, William Cecil, referred to them contemptuously as lewd friends. In May of 1573, 3 of De Vere's servants ambushed 2 men traveling on business for William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. That escapade occurred at Gad's Hill on the road between Rochester and Gravesend, just as it is depicted in King Henry IV, Part 1. The robbery scene, like so many instances in Shakespeare, strategically plants the word ever for evere in conjunction with a variation on truth or true. The traveler says, "Oh, we are undone, we and ours forever." And the prince replies, "Well, the thieves have bound the true men. Now could thou and I rob the thieves and go merrily to London? It would be argument for a week, laughter for a month, and a good jest for evere." The madcap young prince matures by the end of the play, acknowledges his youthful indiscretions, and goes on to vindicate himself as a paragon of courtly grace. In Prince Hal, as in De Vere's documented life, we see clear parallels with Hamlet, who describes himself to Ophelia in most unflattering terms. "I could accuse me of such things that it were better my mother had not borne me. For I am very proud, revengeful, ambitious, with more offenses at my beck than I have thoughts to put them in, imagination to give them shape, or time to act them in." But he's described by Ophelia as the courtiers, scholars, soldiers, eye, tongue, sword, the expectancy and rose of the fair state, the glass of fashion and the mold of form, the observed of all observers. During the 1570s, Oxford was a golden boy at court, a favorite dancing partner of the Queen, and an actor in court performances of plays with titles that suggest they may have been early versions of plays we know as Shakespeare's: The History of Error, Comedy of Errors, History of Titus and Gesipius, Titus Andronicus, Cruelties of a Stepmother, Cymbeline, The Jew, Merchant of Venice. He sponsored many writers who dedicated dozens of their works to him with extravagant praise for his own literary accomplishments. He gained military experience when he served under the Earl of Sussex in the Scottish campaign of 1750, and he witnessed military operations during a visit to the Low Countries in 1574. In 1571, William Cecil was elevated to the peerage, and in that same year, as the first Baron Burleigh, he cleverly consolidated his gains and permanently allied his family with the illustrious Oxford lineage by marrying his daughter, Anne Cecil, to 21-year-old Edward de Vere. Like Juliet, Anne was only 14 years old, an unusually young age for marriage by Elizabethan standards. The Queen approved the marriage, undoubtedly aware that the sweet but vapid Anne Cecil could never rival herself in holding the interest and attention of the brilliant young Earl. The relationship of Oxford and Queen Elizabeth, like that of Hamlet and Gertrude, was that of an attractive and talented young man in his prime for a powerful and fascinating older woman. 17 years older than Devere, Elizabeth served as a kind of mother figure to the young courtier. Some scholars think they might have been lovers for a time in the late 1570s, but that's another, we can't prove anything there. Anne Cecil, on the other hand, remained all her life her father's puppet. Although Anne undoubtedly loved her dazzling but erratic husband, she could be manipulated by her father to report on Oxford's doings, just as Polonius uses Ophelia. In 1575, Oxford finally won permission from Elizabeth to make a long coveted trip on the continent. Perhaps it was in order to keep the costs down that he traveled with only a meager retinue by comparison with most nobility on the road in those days. Only 8 people, I could enumerate them, but such travels were dangerous. And William Cecil, Laird Burleigh, must have been concerned in that his daughter had not yet borne a child to Devere to validate the Cecil family ties to the ancient Oxford lineage. On the road, Edward Devere received word that Anne was with child. However, when he stopped in Paris on his return from a 1.5 years of travels, his equanimity was shattered by the Iago-like manipulation of Lord Henry Howard, working through a Rodrigo-like intermediary, Roland Yorke, who convinced Oxford that the child was born too long after his departure to be his own. During his return crossing of the English Channel, Devere's ship was attacked by pirates, an uncanny parallel with what happens in Hamlet. Oxford's ship docked in Dover, and his wife Anne traveled to Gravesend in her eagerness to see him. But Oxford shunned her. For 5 years, Devere refused to see his baby daughter Elizabeth or live with his wife, who suffered greatly by her husband's cruel treatment. Later, Oxford seems to have regretted his rash acceptance of an unfounded rumor and worked out his remorse in a number of plays on the subject of a wife or a sweetheart wrongfully suspected of infidelity. And here you see the list, Othello, Winter's Tale, so on. Devere and his first wife were to have 2 more daughters before she died in childbirth in 1588. During Edward Devere's travels on the continent, he had visited the French court and struck up a warm friendship with Henry of Navarre, who later became Henri IV of France, who was the prototype for King Ferdinand of Navarre in Love's Labour's Lost. And even Stratfordians admit that. Then Devere went on to fulfill his dream of seeing Italy, the source of Renaissance learning. His documented itinerary included Padua, Venice, Florence, Siena, and Palermo. And there's so much we could go into here, but we don't have time. After combing Shakespeare's plays set in Italy for each reference to a place, streets, buildings, landmarks, or a person or event that occurred there in 1576, Richard Rowe matched those allusions to exact locations and traditions that virtually prove the authors having been there in person. Oxford is known to have attended at least one Commedia dell'arte performance. He was in Siena at Twelfth Night, 1576, and would have seen the Piccolomini Academy's annual production of Gli Ingannati, an old anonymous Italian comedy. Oxford might well have purchased the new edition of Gli Ingannati, which even Stratfordians acknowledge to be the source for Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, although it was not available in English translation during the Stratford man's lifetime. Spending 11 months in Italy, Edward Devere learned to speak and read serviceable Italian and became, in the eyes of his contemporaries, an Italianated gentleman. Oxford's return to England in April 1576 coincided with a great burst of theatrical activity in London, including construction of the theatre, the first English permanent playhouse. Oxford was the acknowledged leader of the Euphuist, practitioners of a literary fad that flourished briefly in courtly circles in 1578. Love's Labour's Lost has long been recognized as a textbook example of euphuism. Not only euphuism, but a number of other topical references in Love's Labour's Lost tie its first draft to the year 1578. And sure enough, a play titled Double Mask, a mask of Amazons and a mask of knights, referring to the sequence in Love's Labour's Lost between the Russians and so on. Anyway, that was performed at court in January 1579. Note that Shakespeare of Stratford was 14 years old at the time. It's unlikely that the Warwickshire dialect-speaking village boy grew up to read works of the 1570s and then write a sophisticated comedy about a long-dead literary fad, while also incorporating allusions to specific characters and incidents at both the French and English courts of the 1570s. During Edward de Vere's 5-year separation from his wife, he found himself utterly captivated by one of the Queen's maids of honor, Anne Vavasour, undoubtedly the dark lady of the sonnets. He was bewitched by her black eyes and hair and her witty repartee, which suggests that she was the model for Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing. Apparently, de Vere gave her a tournament scoring tablet or table with a portrait of the Queen on the cover. The Queen must have been furious because it had been her gift to Oxford. Given that scenario, Sonnet 122 is easily explained as Oxford's apology to Elizabeth. Thy gift, thy tables are within my brain, full charactered in lasting memory. I don't need it in hand as it's a tribute to you, etc. And it goes on to declare that it's a greater compliment to her that he does not need the tables to keep her in mind. Other sonnets, numbers 37, 66, and 89, refer to the author's lameness, the results of a leg wound de Vere received when Anne Vavasour's relative attacked Oxford in the street. In March 1581, only 9 months before Oxford's reconciliation with his wife, Anne Vavasour gave birth to their illegitimate son, whom she named Edward Vere. The Queen reacted to this by sending both mother and babe to be confined in the Tower of London. Oxford was separately imprisoned in the Tower for 2.5 months, an experience that must have given rise to Clarence's scenes in the Tower in Richard III. Edward de Vere's fall from Elizabeth's favor was compounded by his having secretly embraced Catholicism after his return from Italy. In 1580, however, he learned of a Catholic plot against the Queen and denounced the conspirators. The treasonous intentions that de Vere unmasked were enough to bring him to renounce the Catholic faith. As he says in Sonnet 66, and purest faith unhappily forsworn. This was also the beginning of a long process of disillusionment with life at court, a hotbed of political ambitions, personal rivalries, flattery, and hypocrisy. Returning to court in June of 1583, after more than 2 years' banishment, de Vere found it radically changed. The Queen's new favorites were ruthless men, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, Christopher Hatton, and Sir Walter Raleigh, all of whom, like William Cecil Lord Burleigh, had once been commoners, but had flattered and politicked their way to favor and titles. Oxford was surely expressing his feelings of disgust through Hamlet, when Hamlet speaks of the insolence of office and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes. During the 1580s, Oxford's involvement with theater included running his own company, which is known to have performed in Stratford upon Avon in the 1583-84 season. He acquired a sublease of Blackfriars Theatre. At court, his company performed Agamemnon and Ulysses, which might have been an early version of Troilus and Cressida. Running a theater company seems to have caused a considerable drain on Oxford's finances. In 1586, however, the Queen signed a Privy Seal warrant granting an extraordinary annuity of £1,000 to be paid in 4 installments each year to the Earl of Oxford, with no accounting to be required by the Exchequer. Well, this was an unusually magnanimous gesture on the part of the normally tight-fisted Elizabeth, with payments continuing for 18 years, because they were renewed by James I when he came to the throne, until Devere's death in 1604. It's unlikely that it was Secret Service money, because Devere never again left the country. The logical explanation is that Elizabeth recognized the theater's important role in maintaining the social order and proclaiming the glory of English culture, and she saw Devere as the supreme embodiment of that glory. His preeminence is suggested metaphorically in this illustration, which shows Oxford as Lord Great Chamberlain carrying the sword of state before the Queen. England reached a peak of glory with the defeat of the supposedly invincible Spanish Armada in 1588. To give thanks for the English victory over the Armada, the Queen entered St. Paul's Cathedral in solemn procession. A ballad describing the event tells us that 2 noblemen, the Earls of Oxford and Shrewsbury, carried a golden canopy over Her Majesty's head as they proceeded up the nave of the church. This signal honor would explain the opening lines of Sonnet 125. Were it aught to me, I bore the canopy, with my extern the outward honoring, etc. The sonnets, as the poet's most personal writing, offer many clues to his identity in examples to the, in addition to the examples I have mentioned. Many are addressed to a fair-haired younger man, usually thought to be Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton. He was 23 years younger than Edward de Vere and 9 years younger than Will Shakespeare. Because both Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece are dedicated to Southampton, Stratfordian scholars have always assumed, with no hard evidence to support it, the claim that Southampton was Shakespeare's patron. Well, the first 17 sonnets urge the young man to marry. In this regard, it's interesting that in 1590, Lord Burleigh was promoting a marriage between his granddaughter Elizabeth Vere and Southampton. But for unknown reasons, the marriage did not occur. And we can speculate about that later if you're interested. Elizabeth de Vere married William Stanley, the 6th Earl of Derby, on January 25th, 1595. Tradition has it that their wedding festivities included a performance of Midsummer Night's Dream, and scholars have shown that the phases of the moon correspond with the date of that wedding, etc. The phases of the moon in the play. Okay. De Vere's second wife, Elizabeth Trenton, bore him 1 son. The heir to the title was born in 1593 and named Henry, the first Henry in the centuries-old line of Earls of Oxford. Undoubtedly, it was intended as a tribute to Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton. Because Venus and Adonis was published in the same year that the future 18th Earl of Oxford was born, one is tempted to speculate that the poem's dedication to Southampton as so noble a godfather to the first heir of my invention might mean that Southampton was Henry de Vere's godfather. This narrative poem marks the first appearance of the name William Shakespeare in print. So perhaps the publication itself with the name was the first heir of my invention. However, the name does not appear on the title page, but only at the end of the dedication. With his withdrawal from court life after 1591 and his retirement to Hackney in 1596, Edward de Vere would logically have devoted himself to revising and polishing the 40 or more plays he had written, some of which had been performed at court as early as the 1570s. He was deeply affected by the death of Queen Elizabeth in 1603. His own death came suddenly of the plague a year later, June 4th, 1604. For Christmas that year, James I had 7 Shakespeare plays performed at court, undoubtedly to honor the memory of their author. The sonnets were published in 1609, 5 years after Oxford's death. Stratfordians agree that the author of the sonnets could not have had anything to do with that publication, mainly because the edition was full of misprints. Note too the hyphenated spelling of Shakespeare, which signals it as a pseudonym. In fact, standard practice was to place the author's name between the lines, as you see there where it's blank, between the lines on the lower half of the title page. And here the space between those lines is conspicuously blank. It's possible that the manuscript of the sonnets was stolen in 1608 when Oxford's widow, his second wife, Elizabeth Trentham, sold King's Place in Hackney, the house where Devere had lived quietly during the last 8 years of his life. During the confusion of breaking up housekeeping, Hackney resident named William Hall could have acquired, we don't know, could have acquired the manuscript, but it's a WH, which he entered at the stationer's register that year. Perhaps the printer, Thomas Thorpe, whose initials TT appear at the bottom, dedicated the book to William Hall as a wedding gift, because we know that Hall was married in Hackney in 1608. The word ever living was used only in the sense of something or someone divine, eternal, enduring, ethereal. The term could not have been used for someone still alive, as Shakespeare of Stratford was. And of course, Thorpe may have been carrying on Devere's habit of punning on his own name, E. Vere, living. In 1997, John M. Rowlett discovered a remarkably plausible explanation for the odd layout and wording of the dedication. The 3 inverted pyramids are in 6, 2, and 4 lines. 6, 2, and 4 are the numbers of letters in each of the 3 parts of the name Edward D. Vere. If the periods between the words are used as guides and one counts to the 6th and then the 2nd and then the 4th word and then repeats the sequence, the result is these sonnets all by E. Vere IV. Devere's formal signature always has 4 dots over the VV. Well, we won't go into that. Among the many examples of strategic placement of the word ever for E. Vere in connection with the Shakespeare works is the prefatory epistle to the first quarto edition of Troilus and Cressida, published in 1609 and titled A Never Writer to an Ever Reader. News, that is an E. Vere writer to an E. Vere reader. The preface goes on to praise the author, who is pointedly not named. This was one of only 3 Shakespeare plays that found their way into print between Oxford's death in 1604 and the publication of the first folio in 1623. The first folio, published in 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death, 19 years after Oxford's, the Lord Chamberlain's office had been clamping down on traffic in Shakespeare's plays, anticipating publication of an authorized edition with the whole collection. Heminges and Condell seem to have been the front men for a long-planned initiative undertaken by that incomparable pair of brethren, to whom the folio is dedicated, William and Philip Herbert, both of whom had close ties to Oxford's family. Indeed, Philip Herbert married Oxford's youngest daughter, Susan Vere. The Herberts negotiated to authorize the project and enlisted the editorial oversight of Ben Jonson, who has left us many clues that he knew the identity of the author of the plays. In his epigrams, for example, Jonson included poems saluting his famous literary friends. Although there's no verse in the epigrams addressed to Shakespeare, Jonson does write in praise of one that desired me not to name him. In any event, Ben Jonson may be considered the editor of the Shakespeare folio, while the considerable expense of the undertaking was borne by the Herberts, who were also patrons of Ben Jonson. Although the portrait engraved by Martin Droeshout was subject to approval by people who would have known the playwright, it sends some curious signals. Oxford calls mention of the dark line, calls attention to the dark line from the unreal ear to the chin, which corresponds to no known lineament of the human face and would have been lost in shadow had the engraver not highlighted it on either side. Ogburn sees that line as indicative of a mask. Note too the uneven haircut and the sleeve that appears to have been put on backwards. Opposite the portrait is the shorter of Ben Jonson's two poems. To the reader, this figure that thou here seest put, it was for gentle Shakespeare cut, wherein the graver had a strife with nature to outdo the life. Oh, could he have but drawn his wit at well in brass as he has hit his face, the print would then surpass all that was ever writ in brass. But since he cannot read or look, not on his picture, but his book. It's telling you, don't look at the picture. It doesn't mean anything. After the dedication comes a longer poem by Ben Jonson to the memory of my beloved, the author, which offers similarly intriguing ambiguities. Near the end of the poem, for example, Jonson addresses his subject as Sweet Swan of Avon, a probable reference to Oxford's home, Bilton at Dunsmore Heath on the River Avon. As Stephanie Caruana points out on this map of Warwickshire, the site of Oxford's Bilton Manor is marked by a figure holding a spear, whereas Stratford upon Avon, Shakespeare's village, does not appear on the map at all. It should be where there's the square. This drawing was published in 1622 as part of a collection of maps and songs under the title Polly Olbion by Michael Drayton. Jonson's long poem refers also to certain public entertainments staged by Oxford. In 1572, he had presented a mock battle and pageant at Warwick Castle with fireworks reflected in the River Avon. Oxford later restaged it on the banks of the River Thames. The Queen attended both events and expressed her pleasure. Sweet Swan of Avon, what a sight it were to see thee in our waters yet appear, and make those flights upon the banks of Thames that so did take Eliza and our James. In the folio's preface, Hemminges and Condell wished that the author himself had lived to have set forth and overseen his own writings, but since he by death departed, it was left to his friends to collect and publish the works. That's an odd comment, considering that Shakespeare retired to Stratford by 1610, if not sooner. And so he had at least 6 years to foresee and set forth any writing he might have done. It was Oxford whose death came suddenly and unexpectedly when he died of plague in 1604. To me, the dating of the plays by historical context and topical allusions is one of the strongest arguments for Edward de Vere as author. The dates in the Stationer's Register are terminus ad quem, which limits how late they could have been written, while there's no limit to how early they could have been written. De Vere's lifespan allows time for growth, revision, and refinement in the writing. On the other hand, the dates stuck onto the plays by traditional Stratfordian scholars, needing to correlate the works to Shakespeare's life, and not only ignore the topical references, but also unrealistically crunch far too much finished writing into little more than a decade, when Shakespeare would have been in his late 20s and early 30s. Stratfordians will argue that The Tempest had to have been written later than 1604 because it was inspired by a shipwreck off Bermuda in 1609. But that claim has two false premises. First, there were shipwrecks off Bermuda long before 1609. And in fact, De Vere's ship, the Edward Bonaventure, was part of an expedition that lost a ship off Bermuda in 1593 when this map was published. But the second and the more important fallacy is the one phrase from The Tempest that is cited by Stratfordians: the still vexed Bermuths. really does not refer to Bermuda at all. Vermouth was a section of London in which the making of alcohol was unregulated. It was vexed by stills. In 1622, when Henry Peacham drew up a list of poets who made Elizabethan England a golden age, he named in first place Edward, Earl of Oxford, but made no mention of William Shakespeare of Stratford, William Shakesper. This painting, known as the Ashbourne Portrait, has traditionally been accepted as a portrait of Shakespeare, and it's housed at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. I think the Folger curators are right in claiming that it's a portrait of Shakespeare. To me, this Shakespeare looks a lot like Devere. To conclude, it's only, and if we had time, I have another PS postscript with comparison of portraits. But to conclude, it's only right that I allow Edward Devere to speak for himself in the person of Hamlet, his most autobiographical character, for a man to whom artistic expression was his very lifeblood. The restriction against the use of his noble name on any work destined for public consumption must have been a source of personal anguish. The Cecil family's stranglehold on Oxford's name must have been in his mind when he wrote Hamlet's final lines. It seems most appropriate that Hamlet's dying words are addressed to Horatio, because Edward de Vere's cousin, Horatio Vere, was one of his closest friends. Horatio Vere even had custody of Lord Oxford's illegitimate son, Colonel Edward Vere. Hamlet says to Horatio, "Oh, for Oxford, I could tell you, but let it be. Horatio, I am dead, thou livest. Report me and my cause aright to the unsatisfied. Oh God, Horatio, what a wounded name. Things standing thus unknown, shall I leave behind me? If thou didst ever hold me in thy heart, absent thee from felicity a while, and in this harsh world draw thy breath in pain to tell my story." Thank you. I don't know if you have time for questions. I would love to, because I know there are many, and I have had to leave out so many new discoveries that Oxfordians keep finding things, and I don't want this to get any longer than it already is.
Thank you. You've covered a tremendous amount of material. Anyone have a question? Thank you. Ed.
I understand why Devere had to hide his identity while he was alive. Why did his family and everyone who knew about him have to hide his identity, or why did they hide it further?
Yes, and there's been a lot of work done on that recently. A lot of scholars, why, for even a whole generation, and so many people, I mean, out of fear. It gets complicated. That yes, because Southampton was involved in the. Am I supposed to be up there? Or? Okay, because Southampton was involved in the plot, to overthrow Elizabeth, and he was in the Tower and actually would have been executed if Devere hadn't intervened. And there's one scholar, Roger Strittmather. Another one, sorry, but has a theory, he's analyzed the sonnets and thinks that he ties the sonnets to each day of Southampton's imprisonment, and how finally, and he was really worried because Southampton was very close to being executed, but finally exonerated. What did Oxford pay to get Southampton's life? And it might have been to never reveal himself because of the political references. It was so sensitive that if anyone knew Oxford had written those plays, they could just comb through them and find all kinds of things that were going on at court. And, we don't think much of that, but it was a big deal in those days. I mean, I like to give the example as far as why during his lifetime, even in the 19th century America, Nicholas Biddle did not put his name on the Lewis and Clark journals because he was from the famous Biddle family of Philadelphia, and you just didn't do that. You know? So that was kind of an analogy, but that's a good question, and it's a bigger question than I can possibly deal with. Yes.
I'm curious if it was Devere, why the name William Shakespeare was.
Well, a lot of people use pseudonyms on their work. I mean, it's very common. Yeah, and William Shakespeare seems to be accepted as, you know, we say Shakespeare and what we mean everything that was written by whoever wrote them. So yeah, it's Shakespeare is the name on the book, and we've come to accept that. Most people still do. Yeah.
William Shakespeare.
Shakespeare, yeah. That, you know, yes, what you're getting at, that's a good question. How did the reputation get transferred from an anonymous aristocrat to this kid from Warwickshire, you know, who was illiterate? And we don't know. We don't know. I mean, maybe they met in a tavern, you know, and we can only speculate, you know. And we know that Devere's company went through Stratford. Maybe they met there, but yeah, there's so much we don't know.
Shakespeare take on the identity of Shakespeare then in his life?
Yes, that's quite possible, because you know, sooner or later, if you have a name of an author, you need a warm body to represent that author. And it's quite possible that that £1,000 or a portion of it was the payoff to Will Shakespeare for as the stand-in. Diana Price has a book, Who Was Shakespeare? And she thinks that without needing to read, Shakespeare could have been the agent go-between who carried manuscripts to the printer. And it's a whole book. It makes a very plausible case.
Any other questions? Well, I would just like to thank you, Felicia, for giving us an amazingly compact and very, very, very filled explanation of Edward Devere and his authorship. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And please take a handout. And for those of you who are listening from home, if you want to email me, I'll be glad to send you the handouts.
I can get those. If you send me the electronic version, I'll make sure that the people at home, the
Oh,
ones that I hear, get them.
thank you.
Okay. Thank you all.